Some stuff going on in this class. We have an assignment due on Sunday.
Yeah, I didn't see it posted.
Yep, I just got it out.
Oh.
I had gone through a massive restructuring of my data structures canvas. I'm a little behind in game dev too, aren't I? So most recent slides are up. The assignment for this week is now posted. There's a repository for you to actually put stuff. And other than that, I think we're getting to our next in-class activity today, hopefully. So we'll see if we can get there. Last time we talked about the first kind of game balance, which was messing with the difficulty. We also talked about how a few different genres of games changed that discussion a little bit based on the target demographic and what they are playing games for. We also talked about how games have changed in difficulty over the last couple of decades as we've tried to make games target a wider audience. How do we balance something like progression? Because progression can also be an element of that. So different kinds of progression. There's the player's power progression. So how does the player gain power throughout the game? That could be through stat gains, level gains, as they gain abilities, skills, they pick up new items or equipment. It allows for some new set of actions. And of course, player skill can be acquired as well, although that's a little bit harder to measure or account for in the design of the game. There are games that don't have too much player progression in them. So thinking of something like chess, the only progression that you have in chess is just how good you are at it. The more you play it, the more you become aware of certain patterns, certain opening and closings, certain positions where you can start to think ahead 2 or 3 or 4 moves. What is my opponent likely to do? But none of that is leveling up your pieces. You can imagine a game of chess where your rook starts only being able to move 1 square, but as soon as it captures its first unit, now it can move 2. A bishop can only move 1 square. As soon as it captures a unit, it can move 2.
What about promoting a pawn?
Yeah, promoting a pawn, there's a little bit of progression there, sure, where the pawn becomes another piece. But yeah, whatever that works for chess. So you don't have to design a game that has that inherent progression in it. What do we think about this question? Games that either have smooth progression or spiked progression. So smooth would mean you're consistently gaining the same amount of power throughout the game. Or spiked power, where you're going to spend some amount of time at your current power level, but when you change your power level, it is drastic, it is more drastic. Which of those is more interesting from a player's perspective?
Spiked.
Some kind of spiked. If you're spiked, you have to take a lot of care with not having that same power level for too long. Players can get bored of being at that particular power level and start to expect that there's some change in power coming. And if they have to wait for that, that may be one of the reasons they quit the game. But that said, if you're anticipating some kind of large power spike, or you're working towards some kind of large power spike as an achievement, or as you're watching your level bar get closer and closer to full, that can become the achievement. The reason that people are playing the game is to reach that next power bump. So even though it is boring to be where they are, they see that future. So as a designer, it's very important to communicate that to the player to say, there is a power spike coming, keep playing, you will get there. And that can be very motivating from a player's perspective. Any other thoughts on smooth versus spiked power progressions? We've talked about this a little bit. So difficulty progression, the rate of the change of the game difficulty divided by the player power / skill. So thinking of it as a ratio or thinking of it as a quotient helps you to try to aim for the same level there. If you have a way of measuring how player skill is evolving, then that becomes the denominator of this quotient, and you can now scale the rest of the player power to be the appropriate numerator to get to that quotient that you desire. So thinking of a difficult boss being balanced versus some arbitrary random encounter enemy that is stronger than a boss. As you lead up to the boss, you've all played games where there's some enemy that just feels like it's very overtuned for that. Thinking about that and making sure that you're aware of trying to avoid doing something like that. Noticing how difficulty and rewards are interrelated. If a player goes through a big challenge like a boss fight, they expect to be rewarded for that. You need to plan as a designer, you need to know that you're challenging the player so that you can balance the rewards appropriately. If a player is not rewarded for the time and energy that they've put into a particular encounter, then they're going to feel like the game has cheated them somehow. If you don't know what is challenging, then you're going to have players who feel like they've been cheated. Of course, if you over reward your players, that's the other side of that design spectrum. If you do that, then you can create an imbalance because players will go out of their way to get that reward over and over and over if it's a farmable reward. And then players may not be at the level of player power that you think they are when they fight the next boss, because they've gone out of their way to acquire as much power as possible because it felt so rewarding to acquire that power. We can talk about gameplay progression. So how do we distribute the game's mechanics as the game evolves in complexity? Do you throw at all of the players in the original tutorial, or do you save some of those mechanics and introduce them slowly over time? So you would have a new game mechanic, a new level that may have some new features to it. Maybe it's an underwater level where instead of jumping around, you're now swimming around. A new item type, maybe you unlock the ability to equip some rings, and players have never been able to equip rings before up until this point. A new enemy type, now it's flying, and you can't walk up and whack it in melee, and you use some kind of ranged attack to take it down. So something that is a new mechanic, a new experience for the player. How do you distribute that over what you anticipate is the length of your game? There's no right or wrong answer to that, but of course the goal is to sustain player interest so that they want to keep playing. They're always feeling like there's something new that they're exploring in some sense.
How old
Yeah.
are these concepts? When were these concepts first introduced? Are they talking like the 1950s or post 1950s? Like,
So a lot of these concepts are out of a book that was published last year.
okay, I'm just thinking of like the original, like Super Mario Brothers.
Yeah.
And, like how we just talked about like Waterworld. There's like Waterworld in there. It's like, were they just for those concepts in place that they like?
But yeah,
when
the
that came
designers
out?
were thinking about them, but I think any novice designer, if you want to be an expert designer, have to be thinking about those, because you can imagine Super Mario World without the water world. If you just go straight through the entire game with no major changes, how does that affect the completion rate of the game? Do as many people complete the game because they're not experiencing as many new experiences? So people have been thinking about these for a long time, but actually throwing it in this is a kind of balance, because the goal is to sustain player interest. And that's the entire purpose of balance. Because as soon as a game becomes imbalanced in any of these ways, players are going to start quitting your game. Some players, not all players, but you will start losing some of your player base. It is certainly something to think about, but yeah, games have been doing this for a long time. It's just something to be aware of and to have a mental place to think about it in terms of this is an element of the balance of your game. That's what I think is not immediately obvious. Other thoughts? So narrative progression, we can talk about distributing the story as well throughout the gameplay. So just like everything else in balance, you want to sustain player interest. So if you have a narrative driven game, people are probably playing the game to experience the story. That is one of the main drivers of people continuing to play the game. So you can look to the common story structures that we talked about, but make sure that the cutscenes are well distributed throughout the game, that you're not having a 10-hour block of gameplay followed by a 2-hour block of cutscene. If you have some interplay between the player is doing something and then something happens, which forces the player to do something, which causes something to happen. If you're doing that well, the player will feel engaged rather than some of the experiences I've had in narrative-driven games is eventually you set down the controller or you just scoot back from your PC and you sit there and you watch a really long cutscene. And that can be okay if that is the driver of the game. So my go-to as an example of this is Xenosaga for the PlayStation 2. There was a, I think, 75-minute cutscene in that game. Yeah.
Feature length.
Yes, it's nearly a feature-length film as between when you're playing and when you're playing again. And unless you know that cutscene is coming and you're familiar with it, you really just sit there and say, all right, okay.
Can I pause and save in the middle of this thing and
Right.
pick it up later?
Right, you didn't know it was coming. And that can cause frustration when now you don't know and either have to look up story spoilers to figure out, are there more cutscenes of this length? You don't know. So how do you communicate that to an end user? Or is that just okay because it is such a narrative driven game?
In Metal Gear Solid 4, I think the longest cutscene is about 4.5 hours or something like that. But before every cutscene, they say, this will take a while, are you okay with that? But they never tell you how long. So some of them are like 10 minutes and then there's the 4-hour one. So you're just
Nice.
saying, yeah, I'm cool with sitting here for 3 days.
Yeah,
So, yeah, or like, if you don't do something like that, like, or like with Xenosaga, is that one where like, was there any sort of warning that
No.
was gonna happen?
it just happens.
So, what if you were playing, but like, it comes up and, you know, you're tired and you're about to like get off?
It's tough to say.
Is it
Because you're
skippable?
playing.
Yeah, nothing in this game is skippable. Yeah, so you're just kind of left at the mercy of
If you walk out of the room, you miss important story beat information. 'cause
leave
it's
your
an hour
PlayStation
and a
2
half.
on overnight or for a couple of days to come back to the middle of this cutscene
Or hope you saved. just
right before.
that
Yeah,
So you can go
Yeah.
back, can turn it off and come back and then.
yeah. So it creates an important point with regards to narrative of just make sure that, again, you're respecting your player, you're communicating with them, but not in a position where you're giving away the story or breaking the fourth wall with the communication you have with your player as you're designing this, and it's narrative focused. PvP is an important part of games to figure out how to balance. So how do we think about balancing PvP? We'll actually have an entire unit on this later, but we can start with just describing, all right, initial conditions. As the game starts, we want each player to have an equal chance to win the game. So thinking about if it's a real-time strategy game, how many resources are around each player's starting point? Thinking about how to structure the creation of game worlds so that each starting location is the same. If it's a game like Civilization, there is an option for making sure that your starting city is, you start where you don't have to look for a place to settle. You start at a great place to found your capital city. You can also turn that off in case you want to have a more realistic version of that, but it creates balance when all players have that same initial condition, because otherwise it can create initial imbalance that could lead to the rest of the game being imbalanced. So if you're designing a game that has turn order, think about who goes first. Is that a massive advantage? How do you structure it so that those who don't go first have some other kind of advantage that allows it to be more likely to be an equal chance to win when you start. Thinking about Magic the Gathering, if it's a 1v1 game, the second person draws on the first turn, the first person does not. So if you go first, you're always going first when you have 1 land down, 2 lands down, 3 lands down. You're always the first person to cast a spell with that much resource. If you're going second, now you have more options for what you're going to cast when you go second. So is it equal? Is it fair? Is that balanced? Depends on the format, but at least it's more balanced than everyone draws on the first turn or no one draws on the first turn. Because then the person who goes first is at a significant advantage. So that's an important part of the design of the game to make sure that it's not a huge benefit to go first. We want to minimize the benefit of going first. So we talk about starting positions. So things like characters and classes and factions. What are each possible character class at level 1? Do they have an equal ability to complete the tutorial? Do they have an equal ability to, if you're getting into a fight right away, are they balanced against each other at the beginning? Of course, we'll talk about matchmaking algorithms. How can you make sure that the player you're playing against has as close to an equal skill as you can determine? We'll come up with that. There are, of course, multiple strategies. Each one plays differently, but the best games allow multiple paths through the game that still have an equal chance to win in a player versus player setting. So even if you want to be a Magic user and someone else wants to be a Melee user, that can be very difficult to balance because Magic users have an ability to be ranged. But usually that comes at the detriment of less life, less maneuverability, less defense. Can't take the hits once you close into range. So there needs to be some kind of benefit and detriment, a reason why you would pick each one of these classes. But thinking about, okay, what is it like when we pit them against each other? How likely are they to win? If one just slaughters the other for no other reason than it's ranged, or then you have some kind of very important imbalance. Another way to think of this is aggro and control decks in Magic the Gathering. Where is your focus? Is your focus on winning early or is your focus on winning late? Both of those strategies should be viable if you build the deck around that concept. Don't try to balance against someone playing randomly. If your 6-year-old grabs the controller and just starts playing, pushing buttons, you don't want to balance against that. You want to balance against the best strategies and the average strategies that could be put forth in your game. Another thing that's worth talking about is all of the different game objects in your game. So how do we balance game objects with themselves as well as with each other? How do those objects fit within when a player has options? When they select an option, how does that, the balance of that particular game object affect their decision? So one of those would be something like, all right, every competitive deck in a trading card game has the same card. As an example, Soul Ring in Commander decks in Magic the Gathering. Just about every competitive Commander deck has that card. Is it balanced? Yes, if everyone includes it in their deck. But is it balanced against other cards? Not necessarily. And someone who now draws Soul Ring early in a game is at a significant advantage compared to someone who does not. So it's worth at least considering that when you're balancing that object. So individual game objects within the scope of the power of what's available. If one card is always selected or one card is just better than others that cost the same amount, then you have some kind of balance issue. A best gun in a competitive shooter, everyone's always using that same gun, even though there are options that are available, everyone's using that best gun. If there's an imbalanced technology in a 4X game, then you find that players all race toward that particular technology, and the player who gets there first is going to be at a significant advantage because that allows them to do something that no other player can do until they have that technology. In a fighter, there could be a best character That means everyone wants to play that character, and then the meta becomes stale for any of these, because while there are options, there aren't really options for a strategizing player. And that's less important in a player versus environment type of game, but when you have a PvP game, if everyone's playing the same build, the same structure, the same way, it's boring. So one way to define the balance of an individual game object. So if everything around it in the aggregate of what's available in the game is comparable to everything else that you could use in its place, you want to be able to say, yes, this is the right call for me right now because reasons, but there are other reasons that you would want to choose some other object in the game. So you can look at it by its statistics, by its cost, by its rarity, strengths and weaknesses. Each one of those can be used to figure out what is the associated power of this game object compared to other game objects. If something costs more, it makes sense for it to be more powerful. If something is rarer, it makes sense for it to be more powerful. So you could balance by any of these dimensions. If a game object exists in your game, there should be some use case for it. If you're designing a game, go through each of your game objects and ask yourself, when is this going to be used? And there should be some slice in time based on some player at some point in time that says, yes, I should be using this right now. If the answer is no, no one is ever going to use this for any reason, don't include it in your game, or balance it to the point where someone would want to use it for some reason. But it's not something that every developer asks about every object in their game. So you get objects that just no one ever uses. Why do you spend the time creating this object if no one's going to play with it? Common thread through all of this is just fairness. A balanced game feels fair. And balance isn't something that can easily be mathematically defined, or even it boils down to psychology. It just arises from the perception of the game. Does the game feel fair? Does every player feel like when they started the game, they had an equal chance to win? As they made what they felt like were intelligent decisions, did the game respect those intelligent decisions? Or did it just kind of kick you while you were down, still making intelligent decisions, and didn't feel right? The last time I played a board game, I forget what it was called, but I went last. And I thought that was going to be a really fun and interesting challenge to overcome everybody else going last without a benefit. There was no benefit to the particular turn order. And it turned out I started out behind, and I was behind the entire time, despite spending 20 minutes thinking about some of my turns and optimizing to the entire extent that I was capable of. I still not only felt like I was going to lose the game, but it wasn't close. It was inevitable. So that feels unfair. That was my perception of the person who went last in the game. So the game had a balance problem because I felt that way, because that was possible. The fact that I started last was the nail in the coffin, had nothing to do with any of my engagement with the game. But noting that my perception was probably not the perception of everyone else playing the game who had a chance to win. They may have all had fun. So understanding how your players react to being put in those particular situations, how does that feel? What are their perceptions? That can help you to at least get started with that balance. What knobs and dials can you turn to balance something? So difficulty is a knob that you can, is it too easy, too difficult, or just right? You can think of that as breaking it down into each element within the game as well as the game overall. The quantity of things could be anything, too few of something, too many of something, just enough. So this could be in terms of resources, the number of players who are engaged, the number of enemies, and of course, timing. If something is given or done or shown, is it too early? Is it too late? Or is it just right on time? So this can be a major plot point when a tutorial is presented to the player. If there are too many things going on too quickly in a game, there's too much happening that the player becomes confused, trying to break it apart and understand all the different mechanics at a particular point in time. We can call that feature bloat. So of course, I had to go do a Google search and it's like, all right, if there are three dials of balance and it all sounds like it's coming from Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Yes, there is a hidden object game about Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It's probably terrible. I have not played it. So we have these dials that we can manipulate, right? So thinking about this as an algorithm, right? Algorithms have inputs and outputs, where the output is going to be, we want a balanced game at the end. The inputs are things like the target audience. Who is the game being made for? The right decisions of where those knobs and dials should end up is based on the target audience. If you're trying to make a game for a family, something that's family friendly versus Korean speed tuned StarCraft, very different levels of balance. The next input would be the designer's intent. How difficult do you want the game to be for that intended audience? Are we making a Souls-like for 6-year-olds? Are we making a cozy game for competitive Korean StarCraft players? Those are kind of the opposite ends of the spectrum, but you can come up with, there is something in there that is the appropriate difficulty for that target audience based on what you are designing. So there's a scale in that from mediative to massacre is what it's called, to go from a game that could help you mediate or meditate, and a game that could help you destroy a controller. The next input, purpose. What is the purpose of this game? Why are we even making it? So are we balancing this game so the player's having fun? Are we balancing this game so that we are hooking people to continue to give us money? So lots of mobile games do this. They dangle this reward in front of you and say, you can either farm for 2 years or you can pay me for it. There's also this concept of game exerted pressure. So something like you have a level of energy in the game and you can pay to get more energy, you pay to climb the leaderboard in that sense. So I see this all the time in mobile games, but you get very close to a goal. The goal is within reach, and you can reach that goal if you just pay a little bit of money. But the goal seems to get a little bit farther and farther away as you get closer to it. You see this in a lot of games that have exponential currency or exponential progress. So the goal is to get some number to be 10 to the 1000th power. It's really easy to get to 10 to the 500th power. It's moderately difficult to get to 10 to the 750th power. So you feel like, all right, you're making progress, you're making progress. You get up to 10 to the 900th power. You're like, all right, I'm 9/10 of the way there. But it starts to slow down because this is exponential growth. They can slow it down to the point where now every 10 times you get that resource, you're just making one step closer in that. So it looks like the goal is getting farther and farther away in terms of how long at the current slope it's going to take you to get there. If you got to 10 to the 500th in 1 day, it looks like I'm 1 day away. Then 10 to the 750th, it takes you 2 more days. So, all right, now it's going to take about 2 more days. You get to 10 to the 900th and it looks like, all right, this is going to take a month. This is going to take a long time. And that's when the in-app purchase comes in that allows you to get some kind of benefit that allows you to go, all right, rather than taking a month, now it'll take a couple of days. And this is the pressure that the game is exerting on you. Pay me, pay me, pay me. And that's very deceptive. But it's very effective as well. There's a reason the mobile market is so lucrative. And that's that a lot of these design decisions are meant to exploit your psychology. Meant to make you think, I'm close. And then rip that away from you and say, you're still close if you pay. very frustrating. So some knobs, some dials. What goes in are mechanics. What comes out are balance mechanics. So we're gonna jump into a little bit more of, all right, what can we do to balance? So we've talked about the original StarCraft. Any other single or multiplayer games that you've played that felt very balanced? And digging a little bit deeper as you think about that, what design decisions did they actually make that led to that feeling?
Yeah, I think you gotta play the balanced game water.
Some of the fun is in a little bit of imbalance, right? You want to discover what is better than something else. So there is a level of imbalance that is acceptable.
The inevitable stuff Archer every time. This time we're gonna play Wizard.
I'd say like Dragon Age Origins was pretty well
Okay,
balanced. 'Cause
yeah.
The enemies had like the same class and abilities that you did. And if you could work around that, but generally it's like you're setting up at equal footing and then you kind of find it out.
Yeah, yeah. But it's memorable when you see it, right? If you see a balanced game and you recognize that it's balanced, it sticks with you. That's something that becomes a memorable gaming experience. So as designers, we should strive to get a level of balance where the player goes, whoa, this is a balanced game. They're gonna remember your game for years. How about the other question, the other end of the spectrum? What games really don't feel balanced? But rather than just stating how it made you feel, think about it from a designer's perspective. What about the design of that game caused the imbalance that you experienced? Yeah.
Lego Star Wars, the new one or whatever, it's
Yeah.
like super easy, and I think they made it because it's targeting children mostly.
Well, the original Lego Star Wars was amazing.
Other games that this makes you think of? Yeah.
99% of this class has never even played a Diablo 3.
Oh, but yeah,
I'm shocked.
I played.
I'm sorry, I experienced it too.
I quit quickly.
Because the big aspect especially is choose anything except a melee class. And the game is very easy to choose even up onto the harder difficulties.
Right.
Simply because of the loot drop percentages and how easy it is to constantly keep bumping yourself. I think at a level 40. An arrow quiver for my class that dropped that I used up until I was like level 70 into prestige, simply because it was that broken.
Do you think that the designers intended that? Not necessarily with that item in particular, but the feeling of regardless of what you pick, you're going to be successful even at the harder difficulty.
No, because previously I had played the demo as a barbarian and it felt like absolute dog water to play this class. These classes are not balanced properly. It didn't feel rewarding to be a heavy hitter melee class because I could barely hit worth a darn when I get killed in 3 seconds by enemies.
Right. But eventually, if you're able to get to that point, I feel like the benefit or what Diablo is really trying to do in its modern incarnations is to be a more accessible action RPG. They've really tried to market that accessibility, and the way to balance a game for that accessibility is a new player doesn't want to look up a build guide. They want to just play the game and experience the game. If there aren't wrong decisions when you do that, and they feel different, but they feel powerful, that creates a level of player engagement that is hard to break.
Unfortunately, I did not feel that. A
Yeah.
different class, as I played, felt fairly good up until mid-game, where it sort of hit a very hard drop off in how good it felt to play it. Versus the one class I picked from the start, felt very imbalanced and powerful from the get-go.
What's the progression now?
Yeah.
Recently, I'm playing a forest game called Humanity, which is good. So, yeah, Civ 5 and Humanity do combat different.
Yeah.
Civ 5, you can kind of ignore it for about half of the game, and then suddenly it becomes relevant.
Right.
If somebody declared war on you, you could fight them off with a single archer. But in Humanity, they balanced it differently so that I think it was classical era, so like second era of the MS6.
Mhm.
My capital got taken out by just one civ. It's like very different like aspects.
Very different early games.
Very different early games, very different feels to them, because
Yeah.
Civ, you're never gonna feel bad, like, oh, I messed up, I didn't do this, so
Right.
it's like more
Right.
nicer towards new players, but the community one has mixed reviews, I'm sure it has a bunch of play.
Yeah, that is interesting. That you can even have something very close to in the same genre, but slightly different focus creates a very different feeling of progression, but also of balance. Yeah, that's really intriguing. So as we move past these examples, so it's memorable whenever something is very well balanced, but also very memorable when it's not balanced. Those are the experiences that stick with you. So let's think about, all right, how do we measure this? What do we actually have at our fingertips to try to understand the mathematical shape of a game? So multiplayer games, we talked about fairness, equal chance of winning the game. Single player games, appropriate level of difficulty for the player, changing gradually. If we have large jumps in difficulty, then either the player should be rewarded for overcoming it, or you're going to lose players who can't overcome that difficulty hurdle. We've talked about this before, but basically the overall quote for this would be something like change a number and you change the experience of the game. Any single numerical tweak to a game is going to change how the game feels to play for anyone who stumbles upon that change, engages with that change. It changes the underlying strategy. It changes the underlying balance. It changes how people feel about playing the game, even though you haven't changed a single mechanic. A single number changes and the game feels different. So game designers tend to use spreadsheets more than any other tool for keeping track of this. And honestly, it's probably better in a database, but a lot of game designers still use spreadsheets as a way of quickly figuring out how is this progression at particular periods of time. So you can at least start to explore balance as you map some outcome to a particular spreadsheet. You can even spreadsheet an entire game to figure out, okay, how long is it going to take to beat this game? You could emulate it to that level in just a spreadsheet, which is interesting. So you can quickly see in a spreadsheet large amounts of numerical information. You can easily graph them from that. You can easily see that progression. And as you start to see that progression, you can start to make decisions based on the underlying data of your game and not instinct or even player feedback. Player feedback is still very important, but you can start to understand why the player feels the way that they do by looking at the underlying data. No, did I not do this? I remember this being an issue before. Let me quickly make one change to what is going on. This is supposed to animate differently. Even is this? It looks like it's supposed to be correct. Let's see if this is better. There we go, better. So let's start here. We're just gonna roll 2 dice. Do we know what the distribution of that looks like off the top of our heads? Roll 2 dice. What does the outcome look like? So the outcome of rolling 2 dice is some number between 2 and 12. Which of those is most likely? 7. How much more likely is 7 than 6 or 8?
No.
Yeah. Yeah, so getting a sense of exactly where that is, how much more likely is a 7 than a 2 or a 12? 6 times, yeah. So just having that level of intuition, let's say for some game, I want to obfuscate a result by a 2d6 roll. I should know off the top of my head what that means. How likely are we to be in the middle of that distribution? How likely are we to be at the tail end of that distribution? You roll a 2d6, depending on the outcome of what that is measuring, what does it feel like to roll a 2? What does it feel like to roll a 12? What does it feel like to roll a 7? How likely are those with respect to each other? And how does that feel in the moment in that game? So just being able to visualize, if this is what you visualized, when you visualize the 2d6, great. You're ready to use a 2d6. If this is not what you visualized, we haven't studied the underlying math enough to be able to make a decision about whether we should use a 2d6 or not. That's not to say that you need to have this memorized, but if you don't know, it's worth going and looking at to see, does this match with what the experience I want to get out of using randomization for this particular outcome? How likely are you to roll something between a 5 and a 9? You should at least know how to calculate that, or at least know how to get a sense of, even if it's just an estimate, how likely is it that a user gets a reasonable value toward the middle of this distribution?
The Gaussian form, we can assume the mean is 7, standard deviation of about 2 for each way.
Yeah.
Each way, so 95% chance you'll land at that.
I'm sure you've seen all of these rules before. We're gonna quickly go over them because I'm sure you've seen them in some math class or another. But again, worth going over, just thinking about when you're designing any obfuscation behind probabilistic rolls, then it's important. So, duh. I'm not even gonna explain that. Probabilities range between 0 and 1. We know this, second nature by an upper division undergraduate. But things like cumulative probability or expected frequency can become an important question about if you need to roll doubles to escape jail in Monopoly, how many turns is that going to take on average? If you're designing a game like that, you should know how long it takes, but not only how long is it expected to take, what percentage of the time are people going to get it instantly? What percentage of the time are people going to wait 10 or more turns before they're out of jail? How does that affect the game if on your very first pass you go to jail? You're getting toward the end of the game when you've acquired a bunch of properties and then you go to jail. So sought outcomes divided by possible outcomes. In the simple case, it's straightforward, but we have to talk about conditional probability in some cases. So if you're in a simple case, then you can just, all right, what is the probability of a spade in a deck of cards? How many spades are there? How many cards are there? But conditional probability gets a little bit more complicated. So if you want to enumerate and try to figure out what they are, you don't have to do it all theoretically. You can write a program and use large samples to come up with, depending on how large the sample size of the outputs are. So you can create a visual of the probability space with a script very easily. If you're rolling a 2d6, you don't want to do the underlying calculations. You just want to be able to visualize what it looks like. You can get an approximation from that very quickly. On the other hand, a 10d6 has a few more possible outcomes than 36. There are 60,466,176 possible different rolls. You can visualize the output from that, but you can't see easily exactly what proportion of the dice were used to get to that point. It's difficult to visualize. So knowing what you can easily visualize and what you may need some kind of meta visualization for is also important. Mutual exclusivity is important if they don't affect each other at all. So the probability of A is independent from the probability of B. So for instance, drawing an ace or a face card. Is it possible for an ace to also be a face card? No, so we can just add their probabilities because there's no overlap. Some rule, on the other hand, if there is overlap, number of A, number of B, subtract out the number that there can be of both types. So when they're not mutually exclusive, you can multiply their probabilities if it's one followed by the other. So You want to draw a spade and a face card. So how many spade and face cards are there? Well, there are 12 spades and 13 spades and 12 face cards. You multiply them together and you get 3 out of 52. Because there are 3 of them.
Why is that 1 out of 53?
Great question. It's probably a typo.
It's a joker.
Single joker, it made its way in between. It's a bad joke. Er.
That goes in bad.
Well, you're not.
My own threshold of what qualifies as a joke worth telling is just getting lower and lower with each passing day.
Stopped buying the royal clowns and went to the circus instead.
The probability of something not happening is just 1 minus the probability of it happening. Sometimes it's easier to determine this, and it becomes more apparent with more complicated examples. So, for instance, the chance of rolling at least 1 6 on a 2d6. The hard way is to sum all of the mutually exclusive ways. Right? Die 1 is a 6, die 2 is a 1, die 1 is a 6, die 2 is a 2. But you could now say, okay, well, how many ways are there to have both dice roll a 6? First die rolls a 6. First die rolls something other than a 6. And then you sum it together to get there. That's the hard way, because you're summing all of the mutually exclusive different ways that you could roll at least 1 6. They're both 6, the first die is a 6, the second die is a 6. The easy way, chance both dice roll something other than a 6. There are 5 non-6s, 5 non-6s. What is the probability of not having a die roll a 6? You just subtract that from 1, and very easily, very quickly, you get to the intended result. And obviously, this scales with difficulty as you're dealing with more dice or more. So sometimes the easy way is to go from the whole, take out the chunk you don't care about. There's the answer. Rule 8, law of large numbers, crazy important. I love me the law of large numbers. So here's a fun one. Draw out or list the differences that you think there are between a 2d6 and a 10d6. Think about things like, what is the height of the middle, the most likely outcome in terms of its probability? What are the height of the tails? How likely are the least likely outcomes? How many possible outcomes are there? Just think about that for the last minute or so of last couple minutes of class. What are the differences? See if you can actually write out or list the differences between these distributions. What are the differences in shape? What are the differences in maximum height of a value? Is the most likely outcome more likely in a 2d6 or a 10d6? The least likely outcome more likely or in a 2d6 or a 10d6? For which distribution are you more or less likely to get something closer to the middle? Distribution gives you the most extreme outcomes, where you're more likely to get an extreme value. That's where we're gonna stop for the day. And I'll let you stew on that. Well, half of you go look it up and the other half of you write it out. We'll come back and actually take a look at it.
Thinking it'd be more of a steep E for the 10d6, because I'm more likely to get roll 2 6s than 10 6s, so the ends probably aren't gonna be as likely.
Yeah, think about it, draw out your best guess as to what these look like. Keep track of how tall each one of those bars is. And we'll come back and actually look at it. And then we can start talking about what random mechanic would you assign to these things to? What random mechanic would you assign a 10d6 to?
Versus 4 data.
Why?
Start to.
Dragon's breath.
Sixes. Yeah, eventually after that.
Yeah.